Well, welcome everyone. I'm Deb Kerr. I'm President and CEO at Intuit, the Center for Intuitive and Outsider Art. I'm sitting here in Intuit's exhibition of the Henry Darger Room, and what was the collection, you might look around and say, things are looking a little bare in there, Deb, and that is because we are preparing to renovate the museum. We'll be closing the museum after Labor Day, and we are in the process of reimagining what our Henry Darger Room and accompanying Henry Darger exhibition, which tells a little bit more about the world of Henry Darger, what that's going to look like, and we're in prep for that. So we're excited to be doing this webinar series, 3 webinars about the influences of Henry Darger and the power that this room has held for people in its history since its installation in 2008. And I'm really excited today to be here to talk with 2 people who have had some really interesting experiences with the room. First, I'm going to speak with Lisa Stone. Lisa is an art educator. She had a long career as the curator of the Roger Brown Study Collection in Lincoln Park, just a few blocks away from where Henry's original room was on Webster Avenue. We have long worked with Lisa. She was the original co-curator of this room. She and her husband, Don Hallett, are passionate caretakers of environments around the country, and she has had an amazing track record of working with the Kohler Foundation and others to preserve art environments, to preserve the work of self-taught creators wherever they might be found. So she's a real champion for this work, and she's been a champion for Henry Darger and a champion for Intuit. So we're really happy to have Lisa with us. And then I'll be talking with Sydney Walters. I'll tell a little bit more about Sydney's program when we get started with Sydney, but she is a former participant in Intuit's Teacher Fellowship Program. She is a practicing artist, and she's a teacher at Lincoln Park High School, right around the corner from the Roger Brown Study Collection and sort of down the road from where Henry's original home was. So interesting connections there. We were just talking before the webinar about some of the magic that Henry continues to create among his enthusiasts. So with that, we've got some images here that I'll be flipping through while you're talking, Lisa. But tell me about your personal experience, because you were in Henry's actual room at 851 Webster, and what did you experience there in the real room?
I forget exactly when I went into the real room, but I know it was with an Intuit tour. Intuit began showing at a certain point, I should know this year, but I can't remember, it's long ago, began showing, doing tours of small groups of people in the room. And I knew from having read a thesis proposal from a graduate student at the School of the Art Institute that literally a truckload of materials had been thrown out from the room after Henry died or moved out. And so I knew a lot had changed. I knew that Nathan Lerner had used the room as his dark room. So I was still just utterly astounded at how much material there was that directly related to his incredible process. And so we realized that since an enormous amount of material had gone to the American Folk Art Museum in New York, there was a group of Intuit people that were absolutely determined to have a place for Henry Darger studies in Chicago. So without having much of a plan, we actually decided we had a very short time to empty out the room and get the materials. So here's a slide that shows in 1999, piles and piles of wrapped, bundled newspapers and magazines, a dresser, the hamper with his collection of yarn and balls of string. And the room just seemed like a mysterious gold mine of the place where Henry lived and worked. And so if you can advance through the next few slides, we'll show very quickly, we had a group of Intuit volunteers that, oh, here's another view of the main wall, what we considered the main wall, piles and piles of his absolutely beautifully customized art making supplies. And so Intuit volunteers in one short weekend, we did a inventory process, packed everything, including the furniture, and moved it to Intuit's storage area. And then we had to figure out, it took a number of years to just determine a space into its current location where the we always talked about it, or I always talked about it with Jessica Moss, my co-curator, and we talked about it as an evocation of the original room, not a recreation or a replication. We didn't have enough documentation of what it was like. So we were able to get a couple of major elements, architectural elements, including the fireplace mantle and the tile surround, which you see on the back wall, and the chandelier that was over his table. And so this is sort of a goodbye shot of the room before it was rehabbed. And we had Larry Harris do measured drawings of the room and elevations. I'm work in historic preservation and believe very, very, very firmly in having, floor plans and elevations. And this was really just to document the room. And then Intuit had a much smaller floor plan for the place, and so you can see in the upper left-hand corner. And the entire project was a process of working with what we had, which was very, very limited in terms of, Intuit was kind of working on a busted shoestring financially in terms of this project, and we just kind of did it in the spirit of Henry Darger, using what he had. And so it was in 2008 when we finally had the room organized for reinstallation. We considered a number of other examples of artists' home studios, environments that couldn't be preserved in place, such as Lloyd Boland's beautiful Holy Jewel home in Macomb, Mississippi, which is now in very, very many iterations, first at the John Michael Kohler Art Center in Sheboygan, and now its permanent location in the Art Preserve. And there are a number of things about that project that were informing us. I also looked at Francis Bacon's studio, which was this incredibly chaotic, packed room and a half of art supplies and the residue of his artistic process in London. And it was moved to the Hugh Lane Museum Municipal Art Gallery in Dublin. And I have been I have not visited there but in this case, you look through windows. You don't step into the room. There are probably a lot of good reasons for that, but I have to say I am incredibly excited about Intuit's plan. Here are just a few views of the reinstallation or the installation of the evocation, and the chandelier was wired at Intuit. And one of my biggest worries, I have to say, I'm so proud of this view. I think we, working with severe limitations, were able to create a space that really made Intuit more of a destination than it already was, and has been for so long, since 2008, or I think it opened in 2009. It has been a 2008. I don't know if we have any idea how many people have come from around the country and around the world just to be in that room. And so anyway, Deb, I'll let you take it from here.
Well,
Did I leave
Lisa,
anything?
we know that from surveying our guests, about half our guests come in because they know about Henry Darger and they're looking to experience the room, and about half of our guests come in and they know nothing. And I think that we are, thanks to this room, very successful in taking many people down the Henry Darger rabbit hole with us, where they learn a little bit, they get interested, they get inspired. And I think in a few minutes, Sydney can talk to that. I will say that we have some big plans for the future. We're going to be recreating the room. Right now, it's something like 120, 130 square feet. And the new exhibition is going to be about 800 square feet. It'll be on 2 floors. So we're going to introduce Henry to our guests, introduce the art to them, and then they'll come down to another level and experience the room. And I think that we're really excited about engaging people first with the art and the story, and then kind of a big reveal, here's the room where the magic took place. But we do know that a lot of guests come here to absorb the atmosphere. They want to, you know, as you know, Lisa, people love to see the real objects, that the real things that belong to someone that lived before them. Do you have any other thoughts about the impact of having these real objects here for people to relate to?
I know it works. I have been in, I don't know if it's hundreds is an exaggeration, but many, many, many artist spaces and preserved spaces. And there's kind of a gut punch that you don't necessarily anticipate when you step into a place, and it's the real materials. And with Darger, it hits on a really tender, I think, level, because of the incredible fragility of almost everything in the room, and how, if you, in this image, you can see bundles and bundles of really old newspaper and magazines and things that also probably may never be unbundled. We may never know what's in them. I do want to commend Intuit enormously for, in the last couple of years, pouring a huge amount of time, energy, and professional resources into the organization, completely recataloging, and into the conservation of the materials. That weighed on me so heavily because in my time there, it wasn't able to be done, and it was a source of much anxiety. And it's just, it's incredible what you have done and what's going to be coming soon.
What would you like us to accomplish? I mean, thank you so much for those nice words. What would you like us to accomplish? What would be your goal or objective, or your impact that you would like to see on the guests of a future reimagining of the room?
I love to hear that you say that the room itself will be preserved, and the way you approach something, no matter a lot, it really determines in many ways the impact. And so learning about the history and then going down to the room is very thoughtful and beautiful. And I just think the more of Darger's life and work that's available to scholars will just unleash even more and more creativity and scholarship people of all ages. And I know Sydney can talk to that from
Absolutely.
experience.
Absolutely. You know, we'll say that we, in preparation for the reimagining of the room in 2021, we did a series of exhibitions with some Darger scholars. And those exhibitions are on our website. You can look at a 3D tour of them. You can look at the labels. You can look at the artwork that was in those. But I think one of the things that we're really pleased about, and I really thank you for your stewardship on this, Lisa, is that we have these source materials. We have the coloring book pages that he used. We have his carbon paper and his tracing paper and his pencils and his paint pots. And even though other museums have beautiful artworks, I think that in terms of the scholarship and learning about the influences and learning about how and to some extent why he made these works, I think that that research really leans heavily into our collection of the objects and the materials and the clippings and the documents that he saved and the parents' magazines that he saved and clipped from, and his you know, correspondence that we have. So I think that all of that is incredibly valuable, and I thank you, Lisa, for your early stewardship and vision to help us make this happen.
I'll just add one more really quick thing, because it's hard to convey how much, you know, material Intuit has, and the things that you listed are, you know, it's an enormous amount of material, but it's so important now because it's all physical. He's pre-digital. There is nothing digitized. There's nothing. Everything was printed the old world way and hand done and hands on. And I think that in itself is enormously impactful to people of all ages, but especially young people.
You know, last month I spoke with Philippe Cohen-Solal, who is a composer, and I was able to share with him when after I'd spoken with him initially and learned of his interest in creating a whole series of compositions about Henry, I was able to send him digitized versions of some of the music lyrics that Henry had written out by hand. And Philippe he said, I didn't realize he'd ever written any music lyrics. How fun is that we were able to find that and share that with him. So Sydney, you were a past participant in Intuit's Teacher Fellowship Program. And I don't know that if everyone online with us has familiarity with that program, but we work with 10 to 12 typically Chicago public schools every year, and we work with 2 teachers at each of those schools, an art teacher and a teacher of another topic, and those teachers come together and create a cross-disciplinary curriculum that they infuse into their classroom. And one of the things I'm especially proud of is that we are trying to carry through the ethos that you don't have to have great drawing skills or sculpting skills or traditional art skills to have that joy, that release of tension and stress, the increased empathy, and the reduced reliance on drugs that happens through art making. And that is infused throughout that curriculum. So Sydney, tell me, you were just hinting at this before, how did you first hear about Henry Darger, and when did you get to view the room here at Intuit?
So I went to art school, and in high school, one of my roommates got a tattoo, and it was a little girl with a gun. And I was like so interested in like, where is this graphic from? So I first heard about Henry through her tattoo. And then I found out about the fellowship. And it was really exciting because I didn't realize that I would be seeing like his actual room with the same color wallpaper, and everything is laid out very similar to how he had it. And then just like kind of every time I learned more about him, I became like a little more obsessed with his life and like what he's accomplished. And I think there's just like a lot of connections when you first hear about him, because, you know, he's such a resourceful person. And I just feel like that's something I really connected to. It was like someone who lacked something, just like, you know, went and found it out of, you know, their own intuition. And so his resourcefulness has always been something I kind of just, I want to know more and more and more about his day-to-day life, and just like how and why. And so that's sort of how I first found out about him.
So what were your students' reactions to the story of Henry Darger and the room itself?
So we actually got really into this. We spent probably more time on this lesson than a lot of the other lessons, just because of how interested the students were. It was almost like you kind of have their attention, so like you're going to keep moving forward. We watched both movies. One was a documentary about him, so it was like someone else narrating what his life was like. And then another one was the actual movie of his, like they kind of illustrated his drawings and made it into like a full-length movie. And we kind of watched the movie while we were creating. But it was mostly interesting because you have teenagers that kind of forget what it's like to escape into this like dream world of like anything can happen, and like just this childlike mind. So to get them sort of like on Henry's level, we created dream journals. And before the project even started, and before I even told them what we were going to do, we started tracking our dreams and paying attention to like, where does our mind go when we like daydream, you know, collecting symbols, collecting like key ideas, trying to kind of get them out of their everyday thoughts and more of like, you know, where can your mind go? Then we learned about Henry. So it was kind of like, first, let's focus on like getting out of our everyday reality mind to kind of get to the level of where Henry was. So we created these dream journals, and basically every morning when the students came in, it didn't matter what they wrote, but they had to like fill a page with like writing or drawing or doodling or anything, just to kind of get their subconscious to go back into like, you know, what were your last couple thoughts? And then we did a lot of watercolor experiment before they learned. So they don't really know anything about Henry at this point. We're focusing on like being a child again and having dreams, and we're playing with watercolors, and we're doing like salt and wax and just like messing around with different materials. And then we learn about Henry. And we learn about how, you know, he just started collecting and making his own paints, and, you know, he worked this full-time job, and then he would come home and probably never slept, because I think we found out he slept in a chair anyway, which isn't very comfortable. And just how he became completely obsessed with his own mind, essentially. I think the students really connected with that. I think they connected with the fact that he didn't have anything. Our students especially come from all over the city. So a lot of the students are like, well, I can't be an artist because blah, blah, blah. But they kind of can see that like, here's a janitor who, you know, doesn't have a lot of money, is finding everything he uses, and he's creating this world inside of his like tiny little apartment, and sort of living in this alternate universe. And then we started kind of talking about how he resources images, how he self-taught himself, like finding things. I remember reading about he would find things in the garbage, like coloring books or anything he could kind of get his hands on, and he would save them in phone books. So he would kind of compile. I think he had a phone book of just like girls. He had a phone book of plants. And in the phone book, he would kind of stash these single pieces of paper of images of plants, images of girls, images of, you know, backgrounds. And the students started realizing like, wow, like we have Google, like we could Google an image of a child, we could Google an image of a plant, but this person is like so resourceful that they created their own database essentially. So we started kind of looking in our dream journals and collecting our own database of images. some students just drew from, you know, their own experience, and then some students liked the idea of collecting imagery and reusing specific images in different ways. So I feel like it's hard to just teach Henry in like a quick lesson because he's so complex. So we really talked about like a lot of key points. We talked about appropriation, like reusing reusing images and sort of changing the narrative of it. We talked about the narrative of an image, and like all of Henry's work has like a long narrative to it. It's not just like, here's one scene. It's like, here's a whole entire story. We talked about juxtaposition and how a lot of times his images are so striking because there's things that you wouldn't expect together to be like sitting next to each other. The symbolism. So we talked about like how our dreams have a lot of symbols, and then those relate to like bigger ideas. And we also loved the movement of his work and how it's in this like panoramic style where you kind of like walk through it with your eye. And so we kind of went through like all of these different ways of looking at things through Henry's eyes. And then we sort of created these, we basically taped together 2 pieces of watercolor paper to create that long effect. And the students kind of looked at his work and decided whether they wanted to do one scene, or sometimes he has like 2 scenes next to each other where it's almost like a comic book. So it's like, this is first, this is second. So they had a lot of options within that. But I think the best part of it is just seeing their minds in a Henry sort of format. So I got a lot of really random dreams, random ideas. And it's just like, it's kind of a fun way to teach play and to teach just like losing your reality and kind of going into a different world. And then everyone's worlds are so different. So that's sort of where our lesson went. I did send pictures if there's an ability to share them of just a couple.
I'm sorry, Sydney. I'm not sure I got your email.
That's okay. I could share it.
Oh, super. You know, while you're speaking and while you're doing that, Sydney, you touched on some things that I really like. We've been talking about what do we want to evoke in this new exhibition, and a lot of that mystery and imagination, the unreal quality, the unreal realms that he created. I love hearing you talk about what engaged the students and what they related to, because I think those are really important elements that we want to make sure we are evoking and sparking in all of our guests as they come into the Henry Darger exhibition. I really appreciate that. The other thing I appreciate you saying, and I feel very strongly about, is he is complex and sophisticated, and this content is complex. And I think that teenagers, you're a high school teacher, I think teenagers in particular are ready to address sophisticated adult content. And I think he really appeals because of that as well.
Yeah, and we did watch, I mean, you do have to kind of prep them, because in the documentary, it talks about as a child, he was like abused in so many different ways. And so there is that sense of like, this is a little bit, you know, rough to hear a lot of the stuff. And I think a lot of students maybe not necessarily directly relate, but relate to this feeling of just like, you know, where do I belong? And like, who am I? And so for them to hear that he kind of literally came from nothing, and just like was kind of tossed around as a child, that weirdly just like draws them in right away, because they're like, you know, this isn't someone who like went to art school and like has a huge support system. Like they connect to, you know, people who struggle and people who are resourceful, and kind of like the power that goes into being such a resourceful person. It's very appealing to them. I think I can share. I'll share. Maybe I can. Oh yeah, cool. I can.
Please do. Yeah.
And these were just sort of the, just a couple from the project that I really loved a lot. And I loved how some students went vertical with their dreams and some went horizontal. But I really like this. I wish the quality was a little better. This was before
No, it looks good. It looks good.
Google Classroom was like, this was like, if I didn't take a picture and they sent it home, I never saw it again. So a lot of the students were kind of enjoying this panoramic view of like, here's one idea, but I liked how some of them were like comparing two things, like the one on the bottom, it's like comparing these two vastly different worlds. And then some of them were like really intense, but in like a strong way where, you know, the top right one, you have this like thing like grabbing on, and, you know, you're kind of like have these students sort of working through these like bigger ideas. And then what I love about the top left one is this student got really experimental with watercolors and was very inspired by his characters. So she's got the like butterfly type creatures. So some students like went right for their own dream, and some students were just like very inspired by his sort of world. And even the ones that are like kind of silly, like I love the one of the dogs, and it's like raining cats and dogs, but it's like they're falling, and it's just random, but like it kind of works in a Henry Darger type sense because it's, you know, reusing the same image, and like it's telling a story, and it doesn't really make any sense. And then the one with the everyone's on fire, I thought that was really funny. And that's in that student's like very particular style. So she kind of held to like her own style, but like brought it into a dream sense. But I always think it's really nice when you get the projects back and they're all different. Like they're all extremely different. You can see each personality within the work. And they did a really good job with the watercolors too. And like we kind of played around with like mixing stuff up and like using different with like different mediums, and we, you know, mixed salt and we mixed wax. So it was part experimental as far as like materials go, but then I think a lot of it was like getting in your head and like losing your sense of like, this is reality, and sort of trying to go somewhere else. It is kind of like a meditative project in a way.
So Sydney, is Henry present in your own artistic practice?
I think I always I'm always in a dream-like state. I don't like, you know, I like to escape reality in lots of different senses. So yes, and I think I'm also stuck in my childhood mind where, yeah, I think I could definitely relate to Henry Darger because of the idea of he's the kind just never wanted to let go of his childhood, maybe because he didn't have one, but I like that sense of exploration, and I also connect with him being resourceful. My like favorite thing to do is like, what do I already have and what can I make from it? And I think especially nowadays, kids are just like, let me just buy supplies on Amazon. And you're like, why don't you like be creative and look around your house and see what you already have or what you could use or what you could repair.
Yeah, I think that's really an essential part of self-taught art, and what we show here at Intuit is that the artists were incredibly and are incredibly resourceful, that they make with whatever they can find or whatever comes to hand. What really surprises me always about some of Henry's materials is that he's got brand new things that have never been touched, brand new little tins of praying watercolors that we all had as kids that are brand new, haven't been used at all. We do have a couple of questions coming in. Let me ask you both. I'm going to start with Lisa. Henry's actual room has been described as clutter and chaos. Do you feel Henry experienced his space as clutter and chaos?
I can refer to one of the earliest, I think it was the first show of his work at the Hyde Park Arts Center, there was a little catalog produced, and in it, there's a beautiful description of the room before all the stuff was moved out and lots of things. I think the chaos was created after he left. And the description was that the room, there were stacks and stacks and piles, and there were aisles, but despite the enormous volume of materials in the room, it was very ordered. And so someone observed that, and I go with that.
Okay, interesting, because I think we see so many pictures of the room with stuff just piled everywhere. So that's a really interesting observation. Thanks, Lisa.
I would kill for a photograph of that room.
Right, before anyone walked in, right? Yeah, wouldn't that be great? Right. Sydney, what are your thoughts about Henry's room and his space? How do you think that he felt in that space?
Well, it was interesting when we went to we took the students on a field trip, and they got to see the room, and they were just like obsessed with all of his little tins, and like I think they just loved the simpleness of like his world. It was just like books for reference, watercolors everywhere. It's kind of did seem like organized chaos, kind of like if it was your stuff, you knew where everything were, like you knew where all the colors were, and whatever phone book with whatever images, you knew where it was. But I think it's just so awesome that there is the ability to kind of go into his world, because on that documentary, the students got to watch and see sort of what it looks like on a video. And then when they come in real life, it's like, this is like, this delicate phone book with all these delicate I mean, I don't think we were touching anything, but we were just like admiring just like how delicate everything is, and how, he like, you could tell he like appreciated like all of his things. Like he, where I think just, it's students nowadays, everything is like very much like consumption and like owning things, and just this idea of, this was his whole life in this little room. Like his entire world was just made up of like his art materials, his chair, it's all he needed. And so I think that kind of simplicity, even though it is kind of a little like unorganized chaos supplies, I think the simplicity of what he had is really admirable. That like, this is all he needed. Didn't have a TV. There wasn't like any fancy things in his apartment. But he like had this whole vibrant world that no one could even really see. Even going in the room, it's like dark, there's really nothing it's not like he had like bright images everywhere that were like inspiring him. It was just his mind, his paper, and his resources. And I think when you see what he worked with, it makes his work that much more admirable.
Yes, and I we were talking about this last night. We were doing some planning for the new room, and I think that his room was also a safe space. And I think that's something that, as a teacher, you can probably relate to, Sydney, that we want to create safe spaces for our young people. School often isn't that. Home sometimes is not that. Neighborhoods can sometimes not be that. But I think for Henry, that was a space. We've heard reports that neighbors heard voices coming from the room, and the assumption is that Henry was speaking in the different voices of the different characters. So if that did indeed happen, I think that he probably saw his room as a place where he could, as you say, imagine another world, let his imagination create that space. And it was, I don't know how he physically created some of those very, very large artworks and not such a great giant space, but pretty amazing. And we have a nice comment for you, Sydney. Mary just wants to applaud that you're an amazing teacher, and wow, she would anoint you Art Teacher of the Year. So
thank you. That's so nice.
That's so nice. We would love to have more questions coming in, so please type in your questions or your feedback or your thoughts. I see that Lindsay's online here helping us, and she has put in a link to the Room Revealed space on Intuit's website, so you can go and look at those virtual exhibitions. And if you missed last month's session, Lindsay will plug in the link to last month's session, and I'll just make a plug really quickly while we're waiting for questions. Next month we'll be with School of the Art Institute of Chicago instructor and practicing artist Jan Tichy, who has also been very influenced by Henry, so please keep an eye out for the link to that. Sydney, simple vibrancy, perfect. And let's see, that's what I've got. No more questions. I think we are, we've handled the questions. Let me see if I have any more questions. What would you two most like to see or look forward to in a newly recreated Henry Darger exhibition and room? If you could have anything you want in that new space.
Hmm.
I think
You go first.
I was going to say, I'm just I'm just meeting Sydney for the first time today. I really want to study with you. I want to take that exact course and do all that. And that was just a beautiful presentation. And something that occurs to me, because I have seen plans for Intuit's amazing museum renovation, and there's a great maker space there. There's a place for workshops, so people can, in whatever way things are organized, or just people are free to go up and use it. If they're inspired to go respond to that experience, they can do it. And one thing I've always dreamt about and think maybe in the future, in 2024 and further on, I've always wanted to have a group make an actual blank book the size of one of Darger's books, because we have seen hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of magnificent drawings all separated from the book, but no one's ever held the book.
Yeah,
I like the idea a lot.
yeah.
And I think I could definitely add to the idea of a makerspace. I think it'd be really fun to have something. It doesn't have to be in the room, because you don't want to like have any art supplies probably and make a mess, but maybe outside of the room. Even just this idea of like taking a character that already exists and turning it into something else, where he uses like the coloring book pages of the girls. I think it would be fun for people to kind of practice and like have I don't know, watercolors are pretty easy to have out, but I do like the idea of a maker space, because it's like when you're inspired, you know, you have a direct way to kind of play around with those ideas like right outside. So I definitely like the idea of a maker space. Yeah,
and we've heard that from our guests too. They've indicated that they'd like to have an opportunity to trace and draw like Henry. One of the things that we were have been tossing around is we will have a maker space in our new adjacent space that we're calling our Center for Learning and Engagement Opportunities, so CLEO, after one of our founders. But what if, as you're going through the exhibition, there were some prompts? There was a page that you could take with you. Maybe there's another location where there's a prompt, a page you can take with you, and those then direct you back up to the maker space. So while you're right there in the space, something might inspire you, and if there's a way to have a takeaway, besides just taking a picture with your phone, a physical piece of paper that you could take away, and then that would guide you to further making. I think there's something there where we could,
or a postcard for Henry. You can make
right.
You could mail
or could we take everybody's artwork and put it on a long panorama and stick it together? That might be kind of, collage it together. That might be kind of fun.
That would be great.
Okay, take a look at the chat, everyone. Lindsay's put in the link for the session last month, and we can also email that to you with a follow-up. Thank you for being with us today. if you'd like to see that. And in a couple of weeks, we'll have this one posted too. Thank you all for joining and for your questions. Especially thank you to Sydney Walters and Lisa Stone. Thank you for making the time and for having this great conversation about the impact Henry has had on all of us, the three of us, on students, on guests, on your teaching practices, both of you. I really appreciate your insight here.